I didn't lose money first. I lost my voice. It happened at the breakfast table. No argument, no raised voices, just a calm announcement delivered between sips of coffee as if it were the most natural thing in the world. My daughter-in-law smiled and said, "From now on, I'll handle the family finances. It'll be easier for everyone." She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at my son. He nodded. That was it. No one asked me what I thought. No one checked if I agreed. The conversation moved on. Weekend plans, groceries, something on the news. I sat there, hands folded around my mug, listening to my own silence fill the space where my opinion used to live. At first, I thought I had misunderstood. Surely she meant helping, organizing, maybe paying a few bills online. After all, I was older. That's how these things are explained. Convenience, support, less stress for you? But then my phone buzzed. An email notification from the bank, or rather, what should have been an email from the bank. It wasn't addressed to me. It was forwarded, brief, stripped of details. "Just letting you know," my son said, not meeting my eyes. I stared at the screen. The subject line referenced an account I had opened decades ago. My name was still on it. My signature was still the one that mattered. And yet somehow I was no longer part of the conversation. I didn't say anything. I've learned that when something is taken quietly, it's because the taking has already been justified in someone else's mind. That morning, I realized something unsettling. I wasn't being robbed. I was being excluded. There's a difference. Robbery leaves you angry. Exclusion leaves you questioning yourself. I replayed the words in my head. Handle the family finances. Family, finances. Together they sounded responsible, mature, almost generous, but there was a missing word. Me. By lunchtime it became clearer. A bill arrived in the mail, opened, sorted, filed somewhere I didn't recognize. When I asked about it, my daughter-in-law replied gently, "Oh, I took care of that already. You don't need to worry about it." You don't need to worry. The phrase landed heavier than it should have. I had worried my entire adult life. I had worried when my husband died, worried when my son was young, worried about keeping this house, paying these bills, holding everything together when no one else was there to do it. Worry had been my job, and now, suddenly, I was being told I didn't need it anymore. Not because the burden was shared, but because the control had shifted. I began to notice how decisions were being made around me instead of with me. Automatic payments set up without discussion, statements redirected, conversations lowered when I entered the room. No one announced that I was being sidelined. They just stopped including me. That's the part people don't talk about. Financial betrayal doesn't always arrive with stolen money or forged signatures. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in politeness, in reassurance, in smiles that say, "We've got this," while quietly pushing you out of your own life. That afternoon, I sat alone at the table again. The same chair, the same view. But something fundamental had shifted. I hadn't lost access to my money yet, but I had lost my place. And for the first time, I understood something that frightened me more than any overdraft notice ever could. If I didn't speak now, this silence would become permanent. I looked at my phone again, at the forwarded email, at the absence of my name, and I thought, if they can remove my voice this easily, what else will they decide I no longer need? I believed family didn't need passwords. When my daughter-in-law first came into our lives, I welcomed her without hesitation. She was polite, attentive, always offering to help, clearing dishes before I asked, bringing groceries when she visited, remembering small details about my routines that even my son sometimes forgot. She called me Mom early on, her voice light, almost eager. I told myself that was a good sign. After my husband passed, family became something I held on to carefully, not tightly, just carefully, like a fragile thing that needed warmth more than scrutiny. When my son married, I didn't see it as losing him. I saw it as gaining another pair of hands, another voice at the table, another person who might help carry what I'd been carrying alone for years. Trust came naturally, too naturally. When she suggested helping with online banking, just to make things easier. I didn't hesitate. Technology had always felt like a foreign language to me, and she spoke it fluently. She explained things patiently, never making me feel slow or incapable. "You shouldn't have to worry about this stuff," she said once, smiling. "Family should help family." That sentence stayed with me. Family should help family. So when she asked for access to certain accounts, I gave it. When she suggested scanning important documents just in case, I agreed. Birth certificates, insurance papers, property records, all things I had guarded carefully for decades, but now felt safe sharing. After all, this was family. I didn't grow up in a world where you hid things from the people you loved. My parents kept papers in a drawer, not behind passwords. We trusted faces, not screens. If someone needed something, you handed it to them. If they asked for help, you gave it. That mindset had served me well for most of my life, until it didn't. Back then, though, there was no warning bell, no discomfort, just relief. Relief that someone else could help shoulder the weight. Relief that my son had a partner who seemed capable, organized, and willing to step in where I was tired. I told friends how lucky I felt, how modern she was, how grateful I was that my son had found someone who knew how things work these days. Looking back, I can see how pride softened my judgment. I wanted the story to be good. I wanted to believe that trust would be rewarded with care, not leveraged for control. I wanted family to mean safety, not paperwork, not oversight, not second-guessing. So when she created shared folders for documents, I thanked her. When she set reminders for bills, I felt supported. When she said, "I'll handle this," I heard generosity, not authority. Even my son seemed relieved. "You don't have to stress about money anymore, Mom," he said one evening. "We've got it. We've got it." I didn't realize how quickly we can turn into them. There were moments, small ones, when I noticed things shifting, conversations happening without me in the room, decisions summarized instead of discussed. But I brushed them off. I told myself I was being sensitive, that this was what it looked like when younger people took initiative. I didn't want to be that mother, the one who questioned help, the one who insisted on control out of pride. So I stayed quiet. I trusted. I trusted because I loved my son. I trusted because I wanted peace. I trusted because family, to me, had always meant inclusion. I didn't know then that trust, once given without boundaries, can slowly become invisible until you're the only one left outside the circle you helped create. At the time, all I saw were smiling faces, neatly organized folders, and the comforting illusion that I was finally being taken care of. I didn't realize I was teaching them how easily I could be removed. At first, the changes were almost comforting. Bills were paid on time. Paperwork was organized neatly into labeled folders. Things that had once taken me hours now seemed to resolve themselves with a few clicks. Clicks I didn't make, but trusted. I told myself this was progress. When friends complained about their children being distant or uninvolved, I felt quietly grateful. My family is different, I thought. They care enough to help. I didn't question why help increasingly came without consultation. If I asked about a charge, my daughter-in-law answered gently, always with reassurance. "It's taken care of. It's routine. You don't need to worry about that one." And so, I didn't. Not because I was incapable, but because I believed trust meant letting go. There were afternoons when I'd sit at the table sorting old photographs while she worked on her laptop nearby. She looked efficient, confident, in control. I admired that. I thought it meant my son was in good hands. Sometimes she would ask me to sign something. "Nothing complicated," she said, "just a form, just an update." She explained quickly, never impatient, never dismissive. I signed. I didn't feel pressured. I felt included, or at least I thought I did. It never occurred to me that inclusion can be performed, that it can look like care while quietly rearranging the balance of power. I grew up believing that if someone spoke kindly, their intentions must be kind as well. That assumption had guided me through decades of relationships. It had been mostly true. So when my daughter-in-law said, "I've got it, Mom," I heard protection, not replacement. My son echoed her confidence. "She's just better at this stuff," he said once. "You deserve a break." I smiled, though something in his phrasing lingered longer than I expected. A break from what? I wondered. From responsibility? From decision-making? From my own life? I dismissed the thought as ungrateful. After all, wasn't this what everyone said families should do? Step in when parents age, lighten the load, take care of things before they become overwhelming? I didn't want to be the woman who resisted help out of fear of change. So I adapted. I stopped checking certain things as often. I trusted summaries instead of statements. I listened instead of asking follow-up questions. Each small surrender felt reasonable on its own. It was only later that I understood how trust can be diluted, not taken all at once, but thinned out until it barely resembles itself. At the time, everything still felt warm. Family dinners were pleasant. Holidays came and went without conflict. There was laughter at the table, photos on the shelf, familiar rituals continued, uninterrupted. That's what made it so easy to believe nothing was wrong. I didn't see control because it hadn't announced itself as such. It wore the face of helpfulness. It used the language of care, and I was fluent in that language. I had spent my life caring for others, putting their needs first, believing that love meant stepping back so someone else could step forward. What I didn't know then was that boundaries are not the opposite of love. They are its frame. Without them, even the most well-intentioned trust can slowly turn into absence. Looking back, I don't blame myself for believing. Belief is not weakness. Trust is not foolishness. But I do understand now that trust without visibility leaves you vulnerable in ways you don't recognize until your name is no longer on the conversation. Back then, though, I still believed we were sharing responsibility. I didn't yet realize I was slowly being written out of my own story. That's when help started to feel like control. The first thing I noticed was what I didn't see. I stopped seeing the bills. They used to arrive in a neat stack by the door, envelopes addressed to me, my name printed clearly in the corner. I had a routine with them. Open, read, sort, pay. It wasn't exciting, but it was familiar. It was mine. Then one afternoon the stack didn't come. When I asked about it, my daughter-in-law smiled and said, "Oh, I already took care of those, you don't need to worry." The sentence sounded kind, gentle, almost comforting, but something about it lingered. You don't need to worry. I tried to tell myself that this was what trust looked like in practice, that delegation was a sign of confidence, that I should feel relieved, not unsettled. Still, I asked a follow-up question. "Which account did it come from?" She waved a hand lightly. "The usual one." The usual one. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure what that meant anymore. At dinner that night, the conversation drifted to money again. Casually, as if it were just another household topic, my daughter-in-law mentioned a payment that had been made, a subscription that had been canceled, a better option she had switched us to. My son nodded along, occasionally adding, "Yeah, that made sense," or "She looked into it." No one asked me. I sat there, listening, fork resting on my plate longer than necessary. The room was warm, lit by a soft yellow bulb above the table, but the air felt heavy, dense, as if something invisible was pressing down on my chest. When I finally spoke, my voice surprised even me. "I didn't know we were changing that." My daughter-in-law turned to me with a look of mild concern. "Oh, it's nothing major," she said. "It's already done." Already done. The phrase landed harder than it should have. It meant the decision had been made. It meant the discussion was over. It meant my role had shifted from participant to afterthought. My son reached for his glass and said, "It's better this way, Mom. Less stress for you." I looked at him, searching his face for doubt, for hesitation. There was none. I didn't argue. I didn't push. I told myself that one decision didn't define a pattern. But patterns don't announce themselves. They repeat quietly until you can't ignore them. Over the next few weeks, I noticed more things slipping past me, automatic payments set up without explanation, account notifications arriving late or not at all. When I asked to see a statement, I was given a summary instead. "It's all fine," my daughter-in-law said once, her tone patient. "You don't need the details." I laughed softly, trying to keep things light. "I've always liked the details." She smiled back. "That's exactly why we're handling it." The table went quiet after that. I felt my face warm, not with anger but with something closer to embarrassment, as if I had revealed a flaw, as if wanting to understand my own finances was suddenly inconvenient. Later that night, I lay awake replaying the conversation. Was I being difficult? Was I resisting help out of pride? Those questions didn't come from nowhere. They were carefully planted, watered with reassurance, framed as concern. That's how gaslighting begins. Not with denial, but with doubt. The next morning, I checked my phone again. Another forwarded email, another decision summarized instead of shared. I noticed the language changing. We decided, we updated, we handled. And I noticed where I was missing from those sentences. At dinner, the dynamic repeated itself. My daughter-in-law spoke confidently. My son nodded. I listened. The light above us hummed softly, casting long shadows across the table. I wasn't being shouted down. I was being talked around. And that was when it dawned on me. This wasn't about efficiency. It wasn't about convenience. It was about who held the authority to decide what mattered. I hadn't lost access to my money yet, but I was losing access to the conversation. The tension didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through ordinary moments. One afternoon, I asked a simple question. "Can I see the statement from last month?" My daughter-in-law didn't answer immediately. She glanced at my son first, then back at me, her expression calm but guarded. "There's nothing unusual on it," she said. "I already reviewed everything." "I'd still like to see it," I replied. She smiled, the kind of smile meant to soothe. "Mom, you don't need to worry about those things anymore." There it was again. "You don't need to worry." The words felt rehearsed, like a line that had been agreed upon beforehand. My son nodded slightly, as if to reinforce it. "Yeah," he added. "She's just trying to help." Help. I looked at both of them and realized something unsettling. They weren't discussing whether I should be involved. They had already decided that I wouldn't be. That night at dinner, the conversation turned to a large payment. My daughter-in-law explained it confidently, listing benefits and savings, speaking as if she were presenting a report. I waited for her to ask if I agreed. She didn't. Instead, she concluded with, "So that's taken care of." I set my fork down. I would have liked to talk about that first. The room went quiet. My son cleared his throat. "It was time-sensitive, Mom." "I understand," I said, "but it still affects me." My daughter-in-law leaned back slightly, folding her arms, not defensively, but decisively. "We can't run every little thing by you," she said. "It's just not practical." The word we landed sharply. I felt something tighten in my chest. "Every little thing?" I repeated. She sighed softly. "This is exactly what I mean," she said, glancing at my son. "She gets anxious over details." Anxious. The label hung there, unchallenged. I waited for my son to say something, to remind her that these weren't just details, that this was my life, my money. Instead, he looked down at his plate. "She's just trying to make things easier," he said quietly. "Easier for who?" I didn't ask. I already knew the answer. After that, the pattern became harder to ignore. Questions were met with reassurance instead of answers. Requests for information were framed as stress. My involvement was treated like a burden, something to be managed, not respected. I started doubting myself. Was I overreacting? Was I clinging to control out of fear of aging? Those thoughts didn't come from nowhere. They were encouraged, subtly, every time I was told to relax, to trust, to step back. That's the quiet cruelty of gaslighting. It doesn't accuse you outright. It invites you to accuse yourself. One evening, I overheard them talking in the other room. My name came up, followed by a lowered voice. I couldn't hear the words clearly, but I didn't need to. The tone said enough. Decisions were being made about me, without me. I returned to the kitchen and sat down, hands folded, staring at the familiar table that suddenly felt foreign. The yellow light above it cast shadows that seemed deeper than before. I thought about all the times I had chosen peace over conflict, all the moments I had stayed quiet to keep things running smoothly. I had believed that cooperation meant harmony. Now I saw the cost. Silence had become permission. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me alert. I began paying closer attention, not to what they said, but to what they avoided. The missing details, the redirected questions, the way conversations ended the moment I pushed too hard. I understood then that this wasn't about finances anymore. It was about authority. Who decided? Who knew? Who mattered? And slowly, unmistakably, I saw where I had been placed. Not at the center, not even beside them, but just outside the circle, close enough to be affected, far enough to be excluded. I didn't confront them. Not yet. I simply listened, observed, remembered. Because I knew that once control reveals itself, it doesn't retreat quietly. And I had a feeling this wasn't the end of the conversation. It was only the point where pretending became impossible. Everything was still mine. I just wasn't allowed to see it. I discovered it by accident. One quiet afternoon, I opened my laptop to check the bank account, something I hadn't done in weeks. Not because I didn't care, but because I had been told repeatedly that everything was handled. The login screen appeared. I entered my password. Invalid. I tried again, slower this time. The same message appeared, sharp and impersonal. The information you entered does not match our records. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. I hadn't changed my password. I knew that. I clicked on Forgot Password. The prompt asked where the reset link should be sent. An email address appeared. It wasn't mine. I felt my chest tighten, not with panic, but with disbelief. The kind that makes your body go still while your mind races to catch up. I checked again, thinking I had misread it. I hadn't. The account was still in my name, my social security number, my signature on file. Everything about it still belonged to me. Except access. I sat back in my chair, hands resting uselessly on the keyboard. The room around me felt unusually quiet, as if sound itself had been turned down. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the next room, the ticking of the clock on the wall. Normal sounds, an abnormal realization. I wasn't locked out because of fraud. I was locked out because someone decided I didn't need to see anymore. I checked another account. Same result. Another reset prompt. Another unfamiliar email address. I felt heat rise to my face. Not anger yet, but something closer to humiliation. The kind that seeps in slowly, when you realize something has been done to you without your knowledge. I stood up and went to the file cabinet where I kept my documents, or at least where I thought I kept them. The drawer was lighter than I remembered. Folders missing, papers rearranged, some documents gone entirely. I flipped through what remained, my fingers trembling now, not dramatically, just enough that I noticed. I told myself there must be an explanation. There always is at first. I walked into the living room where my daughter-in-law was working on her laptop. I can't log into my bank account, I said, keeping my voice steady. It says the email was changed. She didn't look surprised. Oh, she said. I updated that. My stomach dropped. Updated it how? I asked. She finally looked up, her expression calm, almost apologetic. It was easier to have everything go to one place, she said, so nothing gets missed. One place, I repeated. Which place? My email, she replied. Don't worry, everything's fine. Don't worry. The phrase felt heavier now, sharper. I'd like access back, I said quietly. She hesitated, just for a second, enough to notice. There's really no need, she said. It just causes confusion. Confusion. That word stung. I had managed these accounts for decades, through job changes, through illness, through widowhood, through every season of my adult life, and now, suddenly, I was being framed as the problem. I still want to see them, I said. She closed her laptop slowly. Why? She asked. You trust us, don't you? The question felt like a trap. If I said yes, I surrendered my right to ask again. If I said no, I became the difficult one. I felt something inside me shrink, not because I was weak, but because I was being cornered. I just want transparency, I said. She sighed softly. Mom, you're overthinking this. Overthinking. That's when the humiliation fully settled in. Not because I had lost money, but because I had lost dignity. I had been removed from my own finances while being told it was for my own good. My access replaced with reassurance. My authority replaced with summaries. I returned to my room and sat on the bed, laptop open but useless. My hands shook now, just slightly, resting on my knees. Everything was still mine. I just wasn't allowed to see it. And for the first time, I understood something terrifying. This wasn't about help anymore. It was about erasure. I didn't confront her again that day. I knew better than to argue while still trying to understand what had been taken. Arguments scatter facts. Silence gathers them. That evening, I sat alone in the living room, the laptop closed on the coffee table like something I didn't trust anymore. The house felt unchanged. Same furniture, same photos on the wall, but I moved through it as if I were a guest. I replayed the conversation in my head. It was easier. So nothing gets missed. You're overthinking. None of those explanations answered the only question that mattered. Why wasn't I asked? When my son came home, I watched him carefully. He greeted me the same way he always had, asked about dinner, talked about his day. There was no sign of guilt on his face, only familiarity. I wondered then how long he had known. At dinner, I brought it up gently. I tried to check my account today, I said. I couldn't get in. He paused, fork midair. Oh. Yeah, she mentioned updating that. Did you know? I asked. He hesitated, just long enough. It seemed practical, he said finally. You said you didn't like dealing with that stuff. I felt a hollow ache open in my chest. I never said I didn't want to know, I replied. He shrugged slightly. It's all still yours. Still yours. As if ownership without access was enough. As if dignity were optional once you reached a certain age. I didn't push. I nodded and let the conversation drift away. Inside, something was reorganizing itself. Quietly. Deliberately. I understood now that explanations would keep coming, each one smoother than the last, each one designed to make me doubt my right to ask. That night, I lay awake, listening to the house. The refrigerator hummed. Pipes clicked. Familiar sounds that used to comfort me now felt like witnesses, present, impartial. I got up and went back to the file cabinet. I made a list. What was missing? What had been moved? What I remembered signing and when. Not accusations. Facts. I checked old emails and found a pattern I hadn't noticed before. Notifications redirected, threads summarized instead of forwarded, decisions announced after they were final. It wasn't chaos. It was order. Someone else's order. That realization changed everything. Control doesn't need force when it has structure. The next morning I called the bank, not to complain, not to accuse, just to ask a neutral question about access. The representative spoke carefully, professionally. Yes, the account was in my name. Yes, the contact email had been changed. Yes, it could be changed back, by the account holder. I thanked her and hung up. My hands were steady now. The shame that had washed over me the day before began to lift, replaced by something firmer. Not anger, clarity. I wasn't confused. I wasn't incapable. I had been excluded. And exclusion, I realized, is not an accident. It's a decision. I stopped asking for permission after that. I stopped framing my questions as inconveniences. I didn't announce my next steps. I simply gathered information, dates, names, processes. I paid attention to language. When they said we decided, I noted it. When they said it's already done, I remembered it. Every phrase told me where I stood. Outside the house, I went about my days as usual. Groceries, errands, small talk. Inside, something had shifted permanently. The trust I had once offered freely now required verification. I didn't feel proud of that change. I felt sober. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she looked older, but because she looked alert. Present. as if she had finally stepped fully into her own life after standing at its edges for too long. I sat at the kitchen table again, the same table where the announcement had been made weeks earlier. The yellow light above it felt harsher now, more honest. I placed my notebook down and wrote one sentence across the page. If I don't protect my access, I don't have protection at all. I closed the notebook and slid it into my bag. I wasn't planning a confrontation, I was planning survival, because everything was still mine, and I was done being told I didn't need to see it. I wasn't planning revenge, I was planning clarity. The house fell asleep before I did. Lights went out one by one, doors closed softly, footsteps faded down the hallway. I waited until the familiar quiet settled in, not the fragile quiet of tension, but the deep, ordinary silence that comes when everyone believes the day is over. That's when I went into the kitchen. I turned on only the small lamp above the counter. Its light was warm but contained, pooling just enough to see without announcing myself. The clock on the wall read 12:47 a.m. I laid the papers out slowly. Not all of them, only what I still had. Insurance statements, old bank letters, photocopies I'd kept without realizing why. Things I'd once thought were redundant, unnecessary. Now they felt like anchors. I didn't feel dramatic, I felt focused. For the first time since I realized I'd been locked out, my mind wasn't racing, it was methodical. Each document placed in a neat stack, each date noted, each missing piece acknowledged without panic. This wasn't anger. Anger blurs judgment. This was resolve. I made a list. Accounts, institutions, questions. I didn't phrase them emotionally. I wrote them the way someone who expects answers writes. Who has access? When was it changed? What are my rights? The word rights stayed with me longer than the others. I had spent so long thinking in terms of trust and family that I hadn't allowed myself to think in terms of protection. But protection wasn't a betrayal of love. It was a recognition of reality. At 1:30 a.m., I picked up the phone and searched quietly, careful not to wake anyone. Elder financial rights, account access laws, power of attorney versus assistance. Each result confirmed what my body already knew. What had happened wasn't just hurtful, it was improper. I wasn't losing my faculties. I was losing visibility. And visibility, I learned, is not optional. I found the number of a local attorney who specialized in elder financial matters. I didn't call right away. I wrote it down first, then another, then another. Options mattered. At 2:10 a.m., I finally dialed voicemail. My voice was steady when I left the message. I'm calling to ask about my financial rights. I believe access to my accounts was changed without my consent. I'd like to understand my options. I didn't accuse anyone by name. I didn't dramatize. I didn't ask for sympathy. I asked for clarity. When I hung up, my hands didn't shake. That surprised me. I realized then that fear had been feeding on uncertainty. The moment I replaced uncertainty with information, fear loosened its grip. I cleaned the counter carefully, returning the kitchen to its usual order. I left no sign of what I'd done. The papers went into a folder and then into my bag, close but hidden. I glanced at the clock again. 3:02 a.m. Outside, the streetlights cast pale rectangles on the floor. The world looked still, unaware of the quiet shift happening inside this house. I thought about my daughter-in-law, about my son, about the way words like help and family had been used to explain decisions that removed me from my own life. I didn't feel hatred. I felt awake. That distinction mattered. Revenge requires emotion. Clarity requires distance. I lay down without turning on the light. Sleep didn't come immediately, but rest did. The kind that comes when you've stopped arguing with reality and started working with it. I understood something fundamental that night. I didn't need permission to protect myself. I didn't need consensus to ask questions. And I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard. By the time the sky outside began to lighten, I had already crossed a line. Not toward conflict, toward self-respect. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of paper and coffee. Nothing dramatic. No heavy doors or dark wood panels like in the movies. Just a small room with a desk, 2 chairs, and a woman who looked at me directly when I spoke. That mattered. I didn't tell her a story. I told her facts. My name on the accounts, the changed email address, the missing documents, the explanations I had been given. She listened without interrupting, occasionally making a note, occasionally asking for a date or a detail. When I finished, she leaned back slightly and said something I hadn't expected. "You're not confused," she said. "You're excluded." The word landed cleanly. She explained the difference between assistance and authority, between help and control, between someone managing tasks with your consent and someone removing your access without it. "You never signed power of attorney," she said. "No," I replied. "Then no one has the right to lock you out of your own accounts," she said simply. There was no drama in her voice, no outrage, just clarity. She explained my options, slowly, methodically, how access could be restored, how documents could be reissued, how safeguards could be put in place so that no one could make changes without my knowledge again. Each sentence felt like a light switching on. I asked questions, not emotional ones, practical ones. What if they say it was for my own good? What if they argue I agreed verbally? What if this causes problems in the family? She answered each one calmly. Intent doesn't override consent. Verbal agreement doesn't replace written authority. Family conflict doesn't cancel your rights. I didn't feel relieved. I felt anchored. When the meeting ended, she handed me a short checklist, steps, calls to make, documents to request. Nothing rushed, nothing aggressive. "Take your time," she said, "but don't delay." I walked out into the daylight with the folder tucked under my arm, the sun brighter than it had been in weeks, not because anything had been fixed yet, but because I knew how it could be. That night I didn't announce what I had done. I went about my routine as usual. Dinner, dishes, quiet conversation. I listened more than I spoke, noticing how easily decisions continued to be made without me. This time I didn't internalize it. I observed. The next morning, I started making calls. The bank first, calm, professional. I asked for access to be restored to the email on file, my email. I answered security questions I had set decades ago. The representative apologized more than once. "It happens sometimes," she said carefully. I didn't correct her. I knew this hadn't just happened. I requested statements be sent directly to me again. I asked for confirmation in writing. I took notes, names, times, then the insurance company, then the utility providers. One by one, I reinserted myself into systems I had never actually left, only been quietly removed from. With each call, my confidence grew, not in anger, but in competence. I wasn't reclaiming power. I was restoring continuity. That afternoon, I placed the folder back on the kitchen table, the same table where decisions had once been announced to me after the fact. I opened it and reviewed everything one last time. Nothing flashy, nothing confrontational, just order. When my daughter-in-law walked in and saw the papers, she paused. "What's that?" she asked. "My records," I replied. She hesitated, then said, "You didn't need to do all that." I looked up at her calmly. I did. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize either. She simply nodded and walked away. That told me enough. That night, as I turned off the lights and checked the doors, I realized something important. This wasn't about winning, or proving a point, or punishing anyone. It was about restoring a boundary that should never have been crossed. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made threats. I hadn't demanded explanations. I had asked the right questions, quietly, persistently, until the answers could no longer be avoided. I lay down to sleep feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not safety yet, but direction. And that was enough to keep moving forward. I asked one question. The room froze. Dinner was quiet in a way that felt rehearsed. The table was set neatly, almost carefully, plates aligned, glasses filled just enough. Even the chairs seemed placed with intention, as if order itself could keep tension from surfacing. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. I noticed it because no one spoke. My daughter-in-law finally broke the silence. She talked about budgets, casually, confidently, numbers, plans, adjustments she said we would need to make in the coming months. Her tone was calm, professional, the same tone she used when explaining things that were already decided. My son nodded along, occasionally adding a comment. That makes sense. Yeah, that's smart. We talked about that. We talked. I listened. I had learned how. For weeks, I had stayed silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had been gathering my footing. Silence, I discovered, can be a place to stand, not just something to endure. As they spoke, I watched their faces instead of the table. The ease with which decisions were discussed, the certainty with which plans were presented, the absence of hesitation. None of it included me. The clock ticked again. I felt the weight of the moment settle on my chest. Not fear, not anger, but anticipation. I knew this conversation had to change shape eventually. I just hadn't known when. My daughter-in-law finished explaining her plan and looked up, smiling slightly, as if expecting approval. It'll be better this way, she said. Less confusion. Less confusion. I placed my fork down slowly. The sound was soft, but it cut through the room like a line drawn in chalk. I have a question, I said. Both of them looked at me at the same time. The shift was immediate. My daughter-in-law's smile tightened. My son straightened in his chair. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the room itself had leaned in. What is it? My son asked. I didn't rush. I had learned that timing matters as much as words. Who decided this? I asked, because I don't remember being asked. The silence that followed wasn't polite. It was startled. The clock ticked again, louder than before. My daughter-in-law laughed lightly, a quick sound meant to dissolve tension. Oh, we just thought it would be easier if… I didn't ask why, I said gently. I asked who. The room froze. My son glanced at her, then back at me. It wasn't a big decision, Mom, he said. We were just trying to stay ahead of things. I nodded once. I understand staying ahead, I said. I don't understand being left out. No one spoke. My daughter-in-law shifted in her seat. You've been stressed lately, she said. We didn't want to overwhelm you. Overwhelm. The word hovered between us like an accusation disguised as concern. I wasn't overwhelmed, I replied. I was uninformed. My son frowned. You didn't say anything. I wasn't given anything to respond to, I said. The clock ticked again. I could feel the room tightening around us. Not with anger, yet, but with exposure. Something unspoken had finally been named, and naming it had changed the rules. My daughter-in-law crossed her arms, still smiling, though her eyes had sharpened. We're all family here, she said. There's no need to make this uncomfortable. I met her gaze. It was uncomfortable long before I spoke. That was the moment I knew the silence I had kept all those weeks had been doing more than protecting me. It had been revealing. Because now, with just one question, I could see how fragile their certainty was, how quickly reassurance turned defensive, how fast kindness hardened when it was asked to include me. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't accused anyone. I hadn't demanded answers. I had asked one question, and the room had frozen. No one reached for their food after that. Plates sat untouched. Glasses remained half full. The dinner that had been prepared so carefully now felt like a prop, something staged for a conversation that had already slipped off script. My daughter-in-law was the first to move. She leaned back slightly, crossing her arms, her voice still calm but edged with something sharper. We didn't think it was necessary to run every decision by you, she said. That's all. I nodded, absorbing the words. So you decided what was necessary, I replied. My son sighed, rubbing his temple. Mom, this is exactly what we were trying to avoid, he said. Stress. Conflict. Conflict. The word was used like a warning. I wasn't looking for conflict, I said. I was looking for inclusion. He shook his head. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. I looked at him steadily. It became big when I lost access to my own accounts. The room went still again. My daughter-in-law's eyes flicked to him. He didn't meet her gaze this time. That was temporary, she said quickly, just until everything was organized. Organized by whom? I asked. She hesitated. Not long, just long enough. By us, she said. The word us landed heavily. It drew a line I hadn't realized was there until now. I felt something settle inside me, not anger, not fear, recognition. This was the shape of things, not confusion, not misunderstanding, a structure that had been built quietly, with me on the outside. I want my access restored, I said. The sentence wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. My son straightened. Why? He asked. You know we're not doing anything wrong. I didn't answer immediately. I looked at the clock instead. The steady movement of time felt grounding. Because it's mine, I said finally, and because I didn't agree to give it up. My daughter-in-law exhaled slowly. You're acting like we took something from you. I met her gaze. You did. The word hung in the air, undeniable. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. When she spoke, her tone had changed, less soothing, more controlled. You trusted us, she said. That hasn't changed. Trust doesn't erase consent, I replied. My son pushed his chair back slightly, not enough to stand, just enough to create distance. So what are you saying? He asked. That we can't help anymore? I'm saying help doesn't mean exclusion, I said, and family doesn't mean I stop existing in my own life. The room felt smaller now, the walls closer. Every sound, cutlery shifting, the clock ticking, felt amplified. My daughter-in-law stood up, smoothing her shirt. This is getting uncomfortable, she said. It already was, I replied. She looked at my son. He looked back at her. A silent exchange passed between them. One I had seen before, usually when decisions were being made without me. This time I didn't look away. I want transparency, I said, and I want it now. My son swallowed. Let's talk about this later. I shook my head. Later is how this happened. The truth of that statement seemed to land harder than anything else I had said. No one argued. No one denied it. For a moment, I thought my daughter-in-law might raise her voice. She didn't. Instead, she picked up her glass, took a sip, and said, You're being unreasonable. Unreasonable. There it was, the word that turns boundaries into flaws. I'm being clear, I said. She looked at me then, not with concern, not with patience, but with calculation. We'll see what can be done, she said. The phrase sounded cooperative. It wasn't. It meant delay, control, negotiation on terms I hadn't agreed to. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back with care. I'm done for tonight, I said. My son frowned. So that's it? For now, I replied. I left the table without another word, my heart steady, my steps measured. Behind me, I felt the weight of their stares, but I didn't turn around. In my room, I closed the door gently and sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I simply breathed. The question I had asked had done what weeks of silence could not. It had exposed the structure beneath the kindness. It had revealed where power lived. And most importantly, it had shown me something I needed to see before I took the next step. They hadn't expected me to speak. And now that I had, nothing would go back to how it was. The lawyer arrived 10 minutes early. That alone told me everything I needed to know. He didn't rush. He didn't look around nervously. He didn't bring chaos into the room. He brought calm, professional, deliberate calm, the kind that comes from knowing facts, not feelings. My daughter-in-law was the first to notice him through the window. Her conversation stopped mid-sentence. My son followed her gaze, his expression tightening just slightly. Not fear yet, but awareness. I didn't announce anything. I simply stood, walked to the door, and let him in. Good morning, Mrs. Hayes, the lawyer said, extending his hand. Thank you for inviting me. His voice was neutral, respectful, clear. This is Mr. Collins, I said, turning slightly toward the table. He's here to explain a few things. I didn't say why. I didn't say about what. I didn't need to. We all knew. My daughter-in-law straightened in her chair. Explain what? she asked, smiling tightly. Mr. Collins placed his briefcase gently on the table, unlatched it, and removed a thin stack of documents, neatly organized, tabbed, precise. "I've been asked to clarify matters related to account access, ownership, and authority," he said. The room cooled instantly. My son shifted in his seat. "Is this really necessary?" he asked. Mr. Collins didn't answer him. He turned to me instead. "Mrs. Hayes, would you like me to begin?" "Yes," I said. That was all. He laid the documents on the table, not dramatically, not forcefully, just enough for everyone to see. White paper, black text, names typed clearly, no emotions, no accusations, just facts. "These accounts," he said, pointing gently, "are held solely in Mrs. Hayes's name. She retains full legal ownership, full access rights, and full decision-making authority." My daughter-in-law's smile faded, not suddenly but gradually, as if it had realized it no longer belonged there. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding," Mr. Collins continued. "Granting assistance does not equal transferring control. Without documented authorization, access restrictions are not permitted." My son frowned. "But we were helping." "Intent doesn't override legality," Mr. Collins replied calmly. The sentence landed cleanly. No room for argument. He turned another page. "Additionally, any changes to login credentials, communication preferences, or access permissions without explicit written consent can be classified as exclusion." Exclusion, not a dramatic word, but a precise one. My daughter-in-law opened her mouth, then closed it again. "This," Mr. Collins said, tapping the document lightly, "is not shared management. This is removal of access." Silence stretched. I sat upright, hands folded in my lap. I didn't look at anyone. I didn't need to. Mr. Collins wasn't finished. "Mrs. Hayes has already taken steps to restore full access to all accounts," he continued, "effective immediately." My son's head snapped up. "Already?" "Yes," the lawyer said, "this morning." The timing mattered. It meant I hadn't come to threaten. I had come prepared. My daughter-in-law's voice finally returned. "So what are you saying?" Mr. Collins met her eyes directly. "I'm saying that any continued interference could be considered financial coercion." The word dropped heavy. No one moved. "And going forward," he added, "all communication regarding Mrs. Hayes's finances must include her directly. No exceptions." For the first time since this began, my daughter-in-law didn't say we. She didn't say us. She said nothing. Mr. Collins closed the folder halfway. "This meeting isn't about blame," he said. "It's about clarity." Clarity. That was the word I had been searching for all along. I finally looked up then, at my son. His shoulders were slumped slightly now, not angry, not defensive, just smaller. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't accused, I hadn't begged, I had let the documents speak, and they spoke clearly. No one spoke right away. The papers lay open on the table like a quiet witness, flat, unmovable, indifferent to feelings, the kind of truth that doesn't care who likes it. My daughter-in-law was the first to break the silence, but not with words. She leaned back in her chair slowly, as if distance might soften what had just happened. Her hands, which were usually busy, folding napkins, adjusting glasses, reaching for phones, now rested still on her lap. She didn't look at me. She looked at the documents. My son cleared his throat. "So, what happens now?" he asked. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't an argument. It was uncertainty. Mr. Collins answered calmly. "What happens now is simple. Mrs. Hayes regains full access and authority. There's nothing further required unless she chooses it." Chooses. That word shifted something in the room. Choice had not belonged to me for a long time. My daughter-in-law finally spoke. "We never meant to." Mr. Collins lifted one finger gently, not to silence her, but to pause the moment. "Intent has already been addressed," he said. "What matters now is compliance." Compliance. A word she had used before, just not in this direction. She nodded once, stiffly. "Of course," she said. "Not we. Not we understand. Just of course." I noticed it immediately. The language had changed. The room felt different now, not warmer, not kinder, but clearer. As if a fog had lifted and revealed the furniture exactly where it had always been. Mr. Collins closed his briefcase. "I'll follow up with a written summary," he said. "Mrs. Hayes, if you need anything further, you have my number." "Thank you," I said. 2 words. Steady. Enough. He stood, nodded politely to my son, gave a neutral glance to my daughter-in-law, and left without ceremony. No slam of the door, no dramatic exit. Just footsteps fading down the hall. When the door closed, the silence returned, but it was not the same silence as before. This one had weight and direction. My son rubbed his hands together, staring at the table. "I didn't know it had gone that far," he said. I didn't respond right away, not because I was angry, but because I was listening. My daughter-in-law spoke instead. "We were trying to make things easier," she said. Her voice lacked confidence now. It hovered, uncertain, like she wasn't sure where she was allowed to stand anymore. "Easier for whom?" I asked. She hesitated. The pause answered the question before she did. "For everyone," she said finally. I nodded once. "It didn't feel that way." She looked at me then. Really looked. Not measuring, not managing, just seeing. "I didn't realize you felt pushed out," she said. I met her gaze. "That's because no one asked." Another silence. My son leaned forward. "Mom," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." The word landed gently. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. But it was real. I should have noticed. "Yes," I said. No accusation, no comfort, just truth. He nodded. "We'll fix it." I corrected him. Not sharply, not loudly. "No," I said. "You won't fix it." Both of them looked up. "I will," I continued. "With clarity. With boundaries." My daughter-in-law swallowed. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said calmly, "that help is welcome when it's asked for, and trust exists when there is transparency." Neither of them interrupted. "And it means," I added, "that my finances are no longer a family project." That sentence closed a door. Not slammed. Locked. My daughter-in-law exhaled slowly. "Understood." Again. Not "we understand." Just understood. I stood, gathering the documents into a neat stack. "This conversation is over," I said. Not as a command, as a conclusion. I carried the papers with me as I left the room, not to hide them, not to guard them, but to return them to where they belonged. To me. Behind me I heard chairs shift, not aggressively, not angrily, just adjustment, repositioning. That was the real justice, not the papers, not the lawyer, not the explanation. It was the quiet recognition that something had changed and could not be taken back. That authority no longer lived in we. It lived with me. And I hadn't raised my voice once. After everything was finally put into words, the house didn't feel tense anymore. That surprised me. I had expected anger, distance, maybe even coldness. But what settled instead was something quieter and heavier. The house felt emptied of noise, not peaceful yet. Just still. For the first few days, nothing visibly changed. We ate at the same table. Conversations still happened. My daughter-in-law still asked if I wanted tea in the mornings. My son still followed his routine, as if nothing had shifted. But beneath all of that, the atmosphere had changed in a way that couldn't be undone. No one spoke for me anymore. When the mail arrived, it was placed neatly on the counter, unopened. When financial topics came up, the conversation slowed. Words were chosen more carefully. Pauses appeared where assumptions used to live. The room waited. For me. That waiting carried weight. I spent one afternoon alone at the dining table, sunlight falling softly across the wood. I laid out my papers, not because they were in disarray, but because I wanted to see them clearly. Bank statements, insurance documents, property papers. Notes I had written to myself in careful handwriting. I wasn't organizing chaos. I was reclaiming presence. As I sorted through everything, I felt a sadness rise quietly, not sharp, not overwhelming, just a steady ache, grief for the years I hadn't noticed how gradually I'd been removed from my own decisions. When I finished, I placed the documents into the fireproof safe I had bought days earlier. It wasn't large, it wasn't symbolic, it was practical. I turned the key. The click echoed softly in the quiet house. That sound stayed with me. That evening, my daughter-in-law knocked on my bedroom door before entering. She hadn't done that in years. "Can I come in?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She sat down slowly, folding her hands in her lap. "I wanted to ask how you'd like things handled from now on." The question was careful, controlled, but beneath it was uncertainty. "I want transparency," I said, "and choice." She nodded. "That's fair." The word lingered in the air. Fair. It hadn't existed here for a long time. My son joined us a few minutes later, standing just inside the doorway. "We didn't realize how much we'd taken over," he said. I didn't argue. Realization, even delayed, still mattered. "I don't need to be consulted on everything," I said, "but I won't be excluded from decisions that affect my life." They listened. No interruptions, no defensiveness, just listening. And yet, there was sadness in the room. Not because anyone was being cruel, but because clarity always comes with loss. The loss of comfort, the loss of ease that came from blurred roles and unspoken authority. Over the next few days, routines shifted. I regained access to all my accounts. Notifications returned to my phone. Emails came directly to me again. I handled my own correspondence, my own scheduling, my own calls. It felt natural. And still, something felt different. There was space now, polite, measured, real. Boundaries were forming, not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly. I noticed my daughter-in-law choosing her words more carefully. I noticed my son asking questions instead of making statements. "Do you want help?" Instead of, "We've already taken care of it." That change mattered. But it also created distance. Boundaries do that. They protect, but they also redraw closeness. One afternoon, I watched my daughter-in-law step outside to take a phone call. She glanced toward the house, lowered her voice, and walked farther away before continuing. She was adjusting. So was I. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote a single sentence without thinking too hard about it. Being included shouldn't be negotiable. I read it several times, because once you understand that truth, you can no longer pretend silence was ever peace. The house remained quiet, not warm, not hostile, just honest. And that honesty, even wrapped in sadness, felt like the beginning of something steadier. Boundaries don't announce themselves with certainty. They reveal themselves slowly, through pauses, through restraint, through the quiet recalibration of everyday life. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how conversations changed shape. They didn't stop. They didn't explode. They shortened. Decisions were no longer assumed. They were checked. And when they weren't, I no longer swallowed the discomfort. "I'd like to be included next time," I would say, or simply, "I need to know." Each time I spoke, the room stiffened for a moment, old habits resisting change, but I didn't retreat. I didn't soften the words to make them easier to accept. Clarity doesn't need decoration. One morning, an email notification appeared on my phone, an account update I hadn't seen in months, access restored, no announcement, no explanation. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Not because I was relieved, because I was grieving the fact that it had ever been taken. That afternoon, I sat alone in the living room as sunlight filled the space. The house felt different now, not tense, not warm, just honest. I realized I no longer felt anxious when financial topics came up. No tightening in my chest, no instinct to disappear into silence. That was new, and it came at a cost. There were evenings when I felt the distance more sharply, when laughter didn't linger as long, when conversations ended sooner than before. Boundaries don't break families, but they do change how closeness feels. I missed the ease, but I didn't miss the erasure. My son adjusted first. He began asking instead of telling, waiting instead of deciding. And when I declined help, he accepted it without pushing. That mattered. My daughter-in-law adjusted differently. She became careful, measured, polite. The word "we" appeared less often now, replaced by pauses, as if she was checking whether I was still part of the sentence. Sometimes I sensed frustration behind her calm, other times restraint, but never dismissal. That was progress. One evening she passed me in the hallway and said quietly, "I hope you know we weren't trying to push you out." I met her eyes. "I believe that," I said, "but impact matters more than intention." She nodded. No defense, no justification, just acceptance. That was enough. I learned something important during that time, something I wish I had understood earlier in my life. Peace doesn't always feel comforting. Sometimes it feels clean, sometimes it feels lonely, sometimes it feels like sitting with yourself without distraction. But that kind of peace lasts. I wasn't trying to win anything. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I was simply choosing not to disappear anymore. As the days passed, the house settled into its new rhythm. Not close, not distant, balanced. I walked through my home now feeling present in every room, not managed, not monitored, not quietly edited out of my own life. Included, not because someone allowed it, but because I claimed it. And even with its sadness, that clarity felt like freedom. For the first time in a long while, I woke up without a knot in my chest. No reminder to check what had been decided without me. No quiet worry about what I might discover later. No sense that my life was being reviewed in rooms I wasn't in. The morning arrived slowly. Soft light spilled across the porch as the sun rose, pale and gentle. I wrapped a sweater around my shoulders and stepped outside, holding my coffee with both hands. The neighborhood was still asleep. No conversations, no expectations, just space. I stood there longer than necessary, breathing in the stillness, and realized something simple but profound. No one was managing me anymore. Not my finances, not my time, not my decisions. I thought about how independence had returned to me, not through confrontation, not through victory, but through clarity, through choosing not to surrender control simply to keep things comfortable. Living independently didn't arrive with celebration, it arrived quietly. I paid my bills myself again, not as a statement, not to prove anything, but because they were mine. I reviewed my statements carefully, without tension. Numbers no longer felt like threats. They felt like information. That difference mattered. I scheduled appointments when it suited me. I made decisions without explaining them afterward. When I asked for help, it was because I wanted it, not because it had been decided for me. No one questioned that anymore. And in that absence of oversight, I felt something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Dignity. Family life continued, but it moved differently now. Conversations were simpler, cleaner. There were fewer assumptions, fewer "we've already handled it" moments. When suggestions were offered, they came as questions. And when I declined, no one insisted. That was freedom, not the loud kind, not the rebellious kind, the quiet kind that settles into your bones and stays there. I didn't feel the need to announce my independence. I didn't remind anyone of boundaries. They existed without explanation now. That, too, mattered. One afternoon, my son asked if I wanted help reviewing paperwork that had arrived in the mail. His tone was careful, respectful. "No, thank you," I said. "I've got it." He nodded, smiled, and let it go. That moment stayed with me. Because it wasn't about paperwork, it was about recognition. I wasn't being managed anymore. In the evenings, I returned to the porch, watching the sky darken, listening to the quiet hum of the world winding down. I thought about how easily care can become control, how often love is confused with oversight, and how silence, when used too long, slowly erases you. I had spent years believing that keeping the peace meant shrinking myself, that being agreeable meant being safe, that independence could wait. I was wrong. Peace doesn't come from being managed. Safety doesn't come from being invisible. And independence isn't something you age out of. Standing there at sunrise again a few days later, the light warming my face, I felt settled in a way I hadn't before. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just present. For the first time, my life wasn't under review. It was simply mine. Life didn't suddenly become easier after that. It became clearer. There were still ordinary worries, still moments of doubt, still days when I felt tired or unsure. But none of those moments came with the old feeling of being evaluated, of wondering whether my choices would be approved or quietly overridden. That feeling was gone, and I didn't miss it. I learned that independence doesn't isolate you. It simply places you back where you belong, at the center of your own decisions. I stopped explaining myself, not out of defiance, but out of peace. If I handled my finances a certain way, it didn't need justification. If I declined help, it wasn't a rejection. If I chose privacy, it wasn't secrecy. It was autonomy. Family conversations continued, but they no longer circled around what I should do. They asked what I wanted to do. Sometimes I shared, sometimes I didn't. Both were acceptable now. That balance felt unfamiliar at first, almost fragile. But as days turned into weeks, it settled into something steady. I wasn't trying to rebuild closeness. I was letting it find a new shape. There were moments of quiet sadness. I won't deny that. Moments when I realized how much had changed and how it could never fully return to what it once was. But there was relief, too. Relief in knowing I no longer had to trade my voice for harmony. Relief in knowing that being included wasn't something I had to earn. It was something I claimed. One evening, as I stood on the porch again, the sky fading from pale blue to soft gray, I felt a deep calm settle over me. Not happiness exactly, something steadier. Acceptance. I accepted that choosing myself didn't mean rejecting my family. It meant refusing to disappear for them. I accepted that boundaries don't punish, they clarify. And clarity, even when it costs comfort, creates peace that lasts. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for approval. I wasn't bracing for correction. I wasn't scanning the room for signs that I had stepped out of line. I was simply living, and that was enough. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever felt managed instead of supported, or had to choose yourself quietly without confrontation? Share your experience in the comments. Your voice may help someone else feel less alone. And if you appreciate stories about family, boundaries, and finding peace later in life, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps these stories reach the people who need them most. Thank you for listening. And thank you for staying until the end.